A literacy primer introduces students to the basic skills of reading and writing. There are many types of literacy primers, each type reflecting the philosophy and experiences of the group making them. LEI also has their own philosophy about how that works. And so we're going to go over now some of the general characteristics of an LEI style methodology of literacy primer. Primer materials using the Literacy and Evangelism International methodology are adapted for each culture. So we call them culture specific. You'll find this reflected in the pictures that are there and the stories that are there. Our LEI methodology also uses a picture word syllable story method. A picture word syllable story method. It's not just random sentences or words, but a connected story that's part of those things. We use a consistent format in each lesson so that once you learn to teach lesson 1, you're able to teach all of the lessons in the primer. All of our materials also have Bible content. That's one of the hallmarks of the LEI method. Another thing that we find is that in the very first lesson, adults want to learn to read and write something. So from lesson 1, the adult learns to read something. They come away with some words and some sentences. In addition to reading, each literacy lesson also includes a time for writing, they learn to write what they've learned to read in that lesson, and a time of witness, a time of sharing something from the Bible and a little witness of why you're teaching or what God is doing through that. Another important characteristic of an LEI primer is who writes the primers. Persons who speak the target language write the primers because they are the experts in the language. Persons who speak the language. Another characteristic of an LEI primer is that the illustrations are drawn by a local artist through the first 32 lessons. So all of the illustrations would be of a local flavor and be able to be understood and recognized by local people. So the LEI consultant who comes to help with the primers is the technical person who's helping to develop all that's gone down there. So who learns with an LEI primer? Adults are the focus of LEI primers. An adult who speaks the language fluently but cannot read it can learn to read using these materials. They're designed to keep them interested in what they're learning. With the LEI method, adult learners begin to read in the very first lesson, as we said already. This gives them motivation to learn and come back for the next lesson. They're not just learning their ABCs like we tend to teach children. LEI primers can also be used to teach children, though, as long as they have a fairly good grasp of the language. In fact, some local governments around the world have even started using LEI primers to teach reading in the public schools. Now, who teaches with the LEI primers? Well, people just like you, non-professional volunteer teachers. Because it is these people who know how to read and write, maybe you don't have a long education, but you know how to read and write in your language. You are the ones who are best able to teach. With just a short training like we're doing here, any literate person can easily and effectively teach with these materials. Even farmers, as long as they know how to read, can learn to teach someone to read and write. Sometimes these teachers are paid by a church or an NGO, but usually no. Your situation will be unique to your classes. So who trains with the primers? Those who have attended an LEI trainer's course can train non-professional volunteer teachers. So the person who is leading your course is somebody who has trained with LEI or who has had some kind of training in how to train you today. Now, during the rest of this training, you will learn exactly how to teach each lesson in this primer, what to do and what to say. And there are 5 basic steps used to teach the LEI literacy lesson. And we're going to go over those very briefly right now. These same 5 steps will be used to teach every lesson in the primer. So the first step is teach the picture words. And during this step, you introduce the main words that are associated with the new letters that are being taught in each lesson. The second step is find the picture words. And in this step, you give the student a chance to recognize what they've already learned. Step 3 is to teach the words in the boxes. And in this step, you're beginning to help your student realize that words are made up of word parts and that they can use those word parts to build other words that they might want to use so that they can take syllables that may not have been connected before and put them together. The fourth step is use the word cards. So these word cards are then used to help the student to recognize words in a different context. And then the fifth step for each lesson in the reading portion is to read the story. This is the place where you're really going with the reading portion of the lesson, to help them to read a story that has meaning for them. Besides the 5 steps for reading, each literacy lesson also includes writing, a review, and a witness segment. The teaching guide, including in the beginning of book 1 of most of our primers, explains these parts of the lesson, and you'll be getting more of that throughout the teaching in these other chapters. LEI primers include some special content lessons as well, and we'll be looking at those a little bit later. The more recent primers include 8 health stories and 3 agriculture stories or farming stories in book 2. Along these lessons, the most distinguishing characteristics of LEI primers is their Bible content, as we stated earlier. By lesson 12, all the letters needed to spell Jesus are introduced, and we introduce Jesus for the first time. Beginning with lesson 12, students read a story or a paragraph in each lesson about Jesus or with some other Bible content that's appropriate to the culture and the situation. The primer that you're using may have some unique things in it, but it will still have some kind of Bible content beginning with lesson 12. Then the last 26 lessons, or sometimes 36 lessons now, are easy to read Bible stories that summarize the greatest story ever told. These stories begin with the creation story, the story in Genesis, and end with John's vision of heaven in Revelation. Leaders, another little note for you as you come to this section of chapter 6, you want to really make sure that your trainees have the primers in front of them and that you're going to be using these quite a bit in this next section. I'm going to be talking through the Lambia primer from Malawi, but so some of the page numbers or other things may be a little different in your primers, so you need to adapt this section to fit the primers that you are using. With that said, let's begin. Walking through the primer. So keeping the general characteristics of the LEI primers in mind, let's now look at the major features of the primers. The typical Roman script primer has 72 lessons in 2 books. Note, some of the older Roman script primers usually had 60 lessons, so you may be using one of those, and your trainer will walk you through that as appropriate. Primers with characters not Roman script and other orthographies, such as maybe the Korean or the Hindi, or this is the Malayami primer, that they will have some other unique features as well. So the first thing you want to look at is in the beginning of book 1, you will see the how to write letters that are in the primer. And these letters are going to be in the order of introduction in the lessons. They're not in alphabetical order at this place. Then you also have the title page that will show you the authors and the helpers and the artists, but then we'll also list for you, the instructor, what letters are being taught in each lesson in book 1. And that will help you to know how to prepare. Then a few other little things that are there you can look at. But then most of our primers in book 1 have the teaching guide that explains what to say and what to do. And so this you will want to look over very carefully. That begins on page 4 and usually goes through about page 17. Another feature of the LEI primers is our pre-reading. And all of our primers have a pre-reading section, and there are 2 sections. Normally it's found on page 18. And explains how to teach this section of the pre-reading. And then the second page of the pre-reading usually has content that's specific to that local language, so will be specific to the language that you are teaching. After we go through the pre-reading, then there's what we call the 5 steps condensed. And for you teachers, this is going to be your teaching Bible, so to speak, because this is going to tell you exactly what to say in each lesson. It's also in the full teaching guide, but here this will be a good reference point for you as you are teaching your lessons. And you'll learn to depend on that a little bit as you're getting started. But that's on page 22 of most of our primers, and goes through the 5 steps. Also has a little bit about how to teach writing as well. And then we come to lesson 1. And lesson 1 is the beginning format for all the other lessons of the primer, particularly lessons 1 through 32, but then also the health stories, and then a little bit of change for the Bible story. So we're going to just walk through a little bit of what's about each lesson. Here I have a larger chart that shows lesson 1 of, happens to be the Lambia primer from Malawi. But each lesson has the lesson number here, but then we'll introduce the letters that are being taught in that lesson. And this will help you as a teacher just to know which things you want to emphasize in your lesson. In lesson 1, everything's new. So usually we start with 4 or 5 new letters. Then you will have the picture words. Every lesson will have 2 picture words in lessons 1 through 32. And these picture words will introduce the new letters that are being taught in your primer. So each lesson also has a story. This story is made up of the 2 picture words plus other new words that are being taught in the boxes in your story. The new words you'll find at the bottom of the page as you go through things. And this story will grow in, this is lesson 1, so we only have 2 sentences, but this story will increase a little bit with each lesson that you teach. So I mentioned here we have our boxes, which are our box drills that introduce our new words, but also begin to show the breakdown of the words into syllables and vowels and syllable parts that help the new reader learn the building blocks of how to put words together. Each lesson would not be complete without the scripture. Scripture reference is found in every lesson, and that's for you as the teacher to be able to use during the witnessing section of the lesson. You can read that verse for your students early on, or later on the students can read that for themselves. But that's a jumping off place for you as the teachers. Now, another thing that in our Roman syllable books you will have in each primer, the early lessons we don't do capital letters. We save those. We're just teaching the lowercase letters to begin with. But the capital letter lesson in each lesson in each primer shows how to write the capital portion of the letters that they've already learned how to read in the lowercase. So in this case, it's just kind of layering on a little bit of more information for the new reader. And you'll learn more about that later. And then at the back of book 1 are the word cards. And these are just kind of an illustration for you, the teacher, to see how to make word cards and how to use them. You can cut these out if you want, or you can just use them as a reference point of what kind of words and syllables to use on your word cards for each lesson, for step 4, if you'll remember, right? Then that's basically kind of book 1. Book 2, we also we have the title page, and you'll notice we have some words here rather than letters, because we begin into the health stories and the Bible stories, so we give a little introduction to each one. Once we finish through lesson 32, we have in each primer series a numeracy lesson. Usually that's lesson 33, but it can vary depending on the language. And it's teaching how to write the numeral words, maybe some money references. A lot of people want to learn to read and write for marketing. And then also some basic arithmetic, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and in some places division. The next special lesson is how to write a letter to a friend, because many people want to know how to be able to read and write so they can communicate with their family or who's away or friends and be able to read letters and send letters. So there's the format for how to write a letter in that local area and how to address an envelope. And then we go into, for the primers that have them, health and farming lessons. And just going to show you on page, it usually starts with lesson 35 and just begins the same basic format as the early ones. But you can see now we have a lot more writing going on, more words, but it's the same 5 steps that you're teaching using the health and farming stories. And then we come to our easy to read Bible stories. I just want to remind you, though, that we started our Bible content really in lesson 1 with the scripture reference. Lesson 12, we introduced Jesus, the name Jesus, or some other Bible content, and that every lesson from lesson 12 through lesson 47 has something about the Bible or Jesus in each lesson. Then our Bible content begins usually in lesson 47, and this begins the story of creation is the first lesson, and then we have 26 Bible stories, easy to read Bible stories, and some lesson primers now we have up to 36 Bible stories. But we go through the story of Genesis and creation, the fall of man, Noah and the flood. And if it's the 26 Bible stories, then we go into the birth of Jesus, and we go through Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection, and then his Ascension, and then some of the stories of Acts. And the final stories are about our home in heaven, the Revelation, where God comes again, Jesus comes again and takes us to be with him. And this Bible content is one of the most important part of our primer series, and it's the thing that kind of makes us unique in terms of literacy materials and things. Now, the other thing that we have often in the back of book 2 is hymns and choruses that are unique to that language and to that area. And so these are there. You can use them in your literacy class. You can sing them. You can help your students read them. They may already know the songs, but now they can learn how to read the words that are in the songs as well. Well, thank you for joining us for this section of our training walk through the primer, overview of the primer. And we hope now you kind of have a general idea about how our primers are put together, who's put them together, and how they're going to work, because now we're going into the specifics of how to teach Lesson 1 and the lessons in the primer.